Okay, so here we are in our last segment for the rocket ship project. And what we have left to do is we need to render out our rocket ship in a number of render passes. We need to put them into a compositing application. In this case, we're going to use the learning version of Nuke. And we're going to put all the render passes together and see if we can tweak it and make it look really beautiful and perfect. So the first thing we need to do when we're approaching this is look at this render and decide how we need to split it up, what it is we think we're going to need out of render passes. Now, of course, while we're compositing, if we're missing render passes, we can always come back and make some more. But let's start out with a plan. So this is what I'm thinking. The passes we need are, obviously we need the rocket ship in one pass. We're going to need the smoke in one pass because we're going to want to be able to beautify that a bit. We're going to want the shadow cast on the table in a separate pass because we're going to want control over the density of that and color of that shadow. And I'm also thinking we'd like a separate pass for all the lights because they don't seem that incredibly bright in the raw render, and I think I'd probably like to intensify those a little bit as well. So we'll start with those four render passes: rockets, lights, smoke, and shadow, and take those into comp and see where that gets us. So to begin with, because the way Lightwave works, if we're going to do four render passes, we actually need to create four render scenes, each one with a different set of parameters. So we'll start with just the rocket. So I'm going to take our scene, our particle animation scene that we worked on in the last video, and I'm simply going to save it out. File, save scene as, and I'm going to actually make first I'm going to start with a rocket ship master, and that contains everything that we want to render, and that's the scene that we're going to make our four render scenes from. So I'm going to save this again as rocket ship rocket. And then I'll make one for rocket ship lights, rocket ship smoke, and rocket ship shadow as well. So beginning with rocket ship rocket, what we know we definitely don't want is we don't want the background to render in here. We don't want the smoke to render in here. So we'll turn those things off. I'll go to my volumetrics, Windows, volumetric and fog options, and I'm going to turn off hypervoxels. I'm going to open my scene editor, and I am going to turn off my ground plane so that it's not visible. And I'm going to open my compositing options, Windows compositing options, and I'm going to turn off my background image. Alright, so let's just see how that renders. We can actually make those particles not visible as well in the scene editor if we wish. They won't render right now because hypervoxels is off, but we can make those not visible simply by turning off the visibility of the emitter as well. And also, of course, they have to be not selected. So that's what a rocket looks like. Let's just switch to a VPR and take a look at that and see how that's looking for us. Okay, we still have our background image rendering in, and the reason we have the background rendering, if you recall, is that we put a background image in of our environment so that we could get environmental or image-based lighting and reflection happening in the scene. So what we have here is we have in our backdrop options this textured environment which has our kitchen image on it, just wrapped around for the general illumination and color values. Now we could turn this off. The problem is we lose a whole bunch of lighting. So we need to pull a bit of a trick here, and here's the trick. We're going to switch over into Modeler, and we're going to make ourselves a great big ball. So ball N for numeric, so I can numerically adjust the size, and I want the size to be 500 meters. And I'm saying 500 meters just because I want to be absolutely sure that no matter what's going on in my scene, if I have the scale wrong or whatever, this ball encompasses my scene. There's my scene. I'm going to type F to flip the normals so that it is now an inverted ball. it's inside out. And I'll switch this to texture as well. And I want to make this ball black. So open my surface editor. I'm actually going to change the name of the surface by typing Q. I'm going to call it black ball. I'm going to right click to go to HSV and just turn my value down. Now it's black. I'm going to turn the diffuse all the way down. And that's all I need. That's going to render as black now. I'm going to save this object. Save object as black ball and send it over to layout. Now the black ball is in the scene. Around there I'll go to the perspective view so you can see. I'll back way off here. So there's our black ball in our scene. It's way out there. And the black ball is also in the way of the rays. So let's just go back to the camera view. It's also blocking that background image from reflecting on here. So we need to do a couple of operations on this ball. We'll open the object properties for the black ball. We'll go to the render tab and we'll tell it to be unseen by rays. Bing, there. Now our rocket is rendering on a black background, which we want, and it's still allowing the image-based lighting and reflections to come in from the background. Now the last thing we need to know is that the black ball is going to be black in its alpha channel. So if we do an F9 render of this, and there it is, there's our F9 render, we need to be able to switch this to the alpha channel and know that the alpha channel is black. So if we go up here to the upper right corner of our preview window and go to alpha, we can see that we see transparency from our antenna, and the rocket is white as it should be, but the background is also white, and it shouldn't be. It should be black. We're never going to be able to cut our rocket out without our black background being 0 alpha. So here's how we do that. Once again, in the object properties of the black ball, we simply tell it to be a matte object. Or we could tell it to set the alpha channel to constant black. And now, when we render, we get this render, which looks exactly the same as the previous one, except that when you look in the alpha channel, you can see that the rocket ship is all cut out. And it's nice to see that we can see the transparency on our little antenna. Our little illuminated antenna is working properly as well. So now this alpha channel is what's going to enable us to cut this rocket out of this image and slap it over the background. So this image, this render, is ready to go to render. Now all we need to do is set up a render location and set it to go. So go to our Render Globals tab. This is where we set up our render, all our render properties. We need to go to our Output tab. We want it to save RGB, which it's already set up to be. We want, if we set it to save a 24-bit targa, it'll save the image but not the alpha channel. So we definitely at least want a 32-bit targa or TIFF. You know, these days mostly people render in EXRs as well, and that's not a bad idea because that gives us the full range of illumination data, and then we can re-expose it in comp. So let's find our EXRs here. Here we go. We have OpenEXR. We'll go RGB alpha half, and we're going to set a file location. Okay, so I'm saving it in rocketship renders rocket, and I'm going to name it rocketship rocket underscore 01 underscore, and then the file number will come after that. That's how I'm going to name my render. And at this point, if I'm doing a local render, I'm ready to go. Otherwise, I would save the scenes file, and then I can distribute it to my distributed rendering system, whatever it is, whether it's a huge render wall or a small farm, or maybe you have a little render garden in your home studio. In this case, all I have to do to render this image sequence is hit the F10 button. It'll ask me, it'll say auto frame advance is on. Actually, before I do that, I should double check my general tab and make sure my render range is correct, which it is. First frame, I want to render frame 1 to 225. You trust me, if frame end beep is on, which it usually is by default, you want to turn it off or it will drive you crazy. You definitely want auto frame advance to be on, so it'll automatically advance to the next frame. And once you know your save location is correct, your render range is correct, and you've rendered a test frame to make sure that it looks right, you can go ahead and render it, and that's the F10 button. And it asks me if I want to turn off the render display. Now, if I'm rendering an image sequence, the answer is usually yes, because otherwise each frame one at a time will build up and build up and build up in the render display as image layers, and potentially you'll eventually run out of RAM and crash Lightwave. So if you want to do an image sequence, especially one as long as 225 frames, definitely the answer to this is yes, I want to turn off the render display. So it'll show in this little window, but when the frame is finished, it won't pop up in a larger window for sure. So we'll go ahead and let this render. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is create a mat for the little tip lights and for our antenna lights so we can enhance them later on in comp. Now we could go back to our master scene. However, this one's already set up with the black ball in the background and it's ready to go, and all we really need to do is make a few changes to the model. So here's how we're going to do that. Let's pop into Modeler and find our rocket ship. There it is. The first thing is we're going to make some real changes to this model. So the first thing we want to do is save it under a new name. And when we save this under a new name, because Modeler and Layout are connected via the hub, the object that's currently in Layout will change to that new name. And it's really important to do this because we want to make sure that we don't change rocketship version 4 because it is being used in the rocketship render. Definitely don't want to change and overwrite it or it'll screw up our renders. So the first thing we'll do is go File. Let's just look back at Layout for a moment. We can see, I just want to confirm that you see that in the scene editor, the rocketship in here is rocketship 04. It's the same one that's currently in Modeler. Alright? So in Modeler we have rocketship 04. We're going to save object as rocketship lights mat. So we've saved this object as rocketship lights mat, and if we go back into Layout, we can see right away that the rocketship has changed to rocketship lights mat. So we're now going to save this scene as rocketship lights mat. Alright, so now we have a scene and a rocket ship with the correct name. We're completely disconnected from a rocket ship rocket render scene file. So now we can go ahead and make changes to this rocket with total impunity. Here's what we want to do. We want to take all the surfaces that are illuminated and make them white in the render, and we want to take all the other surfaces and make them black. That's pretty straightforward. We go to polygons, type W to get the polygon statistics, and we want to look at surfaces. So we want to select antenna, and these lights, wing light 1, wing light 2, plus wing light 3, and wing light 4. Those are all of the surfaces we're interested in for this render. So we're going to open, we're going to type Q to give those a new surface name, and we're simply going to call them white. And then we're going to do the inverse. We're going to select all the other surfaces. And This takes a minute, but you only have to do it the one time. Make sure not to select white. And now we're going to rename these black. So now we have two surfaces on here, but they're currently both black. These other surfaces will disappear when we close and reload this model. But for now, black, we want to make sure it's 0 luminous, 0 diffuse, good, because we want it to come out completely black. We also want to go to the advanced channel and make its alpha value a constant value of 0. That means in the alpha channel, everything that's black in here will come out as 0 and not be visible in the render. We want to go to our white, and we want to make sure that the constant value is 255, so it'll always be perfectly white. We also want to go back to the basic tab, make sure the luminosity is on, make sure the value is 1. So these now will come out, and diffuse is 0, so there's no shading on it. So these now will come out as perfectly flat white, and they'll make a perfect matte for us. So we can save this object, S. Now when we go back into our layout, I'll update in a second, there we go. There's our render. So now our render is ready to go. We once again need to go back into our render globals, and we need to set a new output path. Crucial not to forget this, because if you don't, then you will overwrite the previous renders. So this is going to be rocketship. We want to put it in a different location too. Instead of under rocket, it's going to be new folder, lights, matte, and we're going to give the file name, instead of rocketship rocket01, it's going to be rocketship lights matte 01. Now because this is just a matte pass, we can go to our global illumination tab and turn off enable radiosity. We definitely do not require radiosity for this render. It's just going to take a lot of extra time, and these renders now should be very quick. We definitely want to take the opportunity to optimize renders whenever we can. It needs to be the same resolution, the same anti-aliasing, and all that stuff needs to be the same as the other renders so that the matte will match up. But you see it now renders in just under 11 seconds, and that's pretty good. So we can set that render pass to render. First we'll just be double sure we've saved the scene. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is render out our smoke pass. So we need to go back to our master scene. I'll go ahead and load. I may as well save those. Go back to rocketship master and load that up. So we have our rocket, we have our particles all in there, and I'm sure if we look in our VPR we'll see that our volume is rendering in there as well. Yep, there it is. Now here's a little tip about particles, especially fast-moving particles. We really need to put motion blur on these. So open our camera properties, and we'll see down at the bottom we have the option for motion blur. Well, we can turn that on. You may notice that I left motion blur off for the rocket. The reason I chose to do that is that the rocket is actually moving very slowly. I don't think the motion blur is going to be missed, so I'm not going to use it on my first render, and that's going to give me a fairly significant render time improvement. If I render it out and I find out the motion blur is really bothersome to me, I'll re-render it with motion blur. But to begin with, I'm going to do the least amount and the quickest render that I can, theorizing that it will work just fine, and I bet it probably will. However, for the smoke, these particles are moving fairly quickly, so they do need a bit of motion blur. The trick is that they are the volumes, the hypervoxels, are taking their motion from the particles. And particles calculate motion blur differently than the geometry, so you need to turn particle blur on in order to get that. Now, the trick here is that we already have our rocket as a separate render pass. And we can see that the smoke at times is in front of or behind our rocket. Let's just find a good frame here. This is a pretty good one. So here we have smoke that's in front of the rocket, and we also have smoke that's behind the rocket. So we need a way to cut our rocket out of this smoke. Here's how we go about doing that. We follow a similar principle as we did in the previous shot, where we make our rocket into a matte object. Now in the rocket ship pass, we showed kind of an old school way of making the rocket ship into a matte object and creating separate matte passes for the lights. And we did that. We had to do that because that was surface based. Parts of the geometry we wanted to be white, and parts of the geometry we wanted to be black. So we did it that way. In this case, we want the whole thing to be black, just a black matte object. This is really simple to do. Simply open up our scene editor and select all of the objects in our rocket ship from top to bottom. Select them all. Open the properties panel for those objects, and we simply click on matte object. And I want you to watch what happens to the render back here when I click matte object. It all just turns into a black matte object. This is what's called a holdout matte, and it means that the element going in front and behind is cut out in such a way that we'll be able to take our rocket ship and stick it right in there. So here's the image rendered out with the rocket as a matte object, and if we look in the alpha channel, we can see that the rocket is not 0 alpha inside the matte channel. And the other thing we notice if we look inside the alpha channel is we also see our polygon that we put in for our table to project our table image onto. So the two things we need to do is get the table object and the rocket out of the alpha channel so that we can put our rocket in behind our smoke here and have it properly layer. And those are both very straightforward to do. Once again, back in our scene editor, simply grab the ground plane, go to the object properties, set its alpha channel to constant black. And for the rocket ship itself, again, we'll grab all of its items, all the separate objects, and set their alpha channels to constant black. And I'll do a quick render and we'll take a look at it again. So here's our render, and we can see that in the previous render they look the same, substantially the same, but in the alpha channel you can see that the rocket ship is now not as in part of the render. In the previous one we had the rocket ship and the ground plane, and now just the smoke is showing up and the rocket ship is cut out of it, and the ground plane is also missing from the background. So this is going to work really well for our render. Now, one of the things we actually should have done before we started all this is we should have gone ahead and saved the scene under a different name. So let's do that right now. Save scene as, and we still call the master. We want to rename it to rocket ship smoke. And we want to go to our render globals and set our output so that we're not overwriting the previous files. So here in our render directory, we'll put a new directory, and we'll call it smoke. And inside of that, we'll rename our file name to rocket ship smoke, and 01 of course is the version number. Last thing we need to do is resave the scene file, and once we do that, the scene is ready for render. So the last pass that we need to create is the shadow pass, and that's the shadow from the rocket and the smoke being cast onto the ground plane. And here in VPR we can see that the geometry is casting a shadow, but the hypervoxels isn't. This is a limitation of a Lightwave 10, and I'm sure NewTek will add that functionality soon. They've been really adding a lot to VPR, especially just before the release of 10. And I'm sure that trend will continue. If we do an F9 render, we will see the hypervoxels do cast shadow onto this plane. And if you recall, this plane is simply a piece of geometry. Here, I'll go into wireframe for the moment so you can see it. It's simply a piece of geometry that we've put down and projected the image onto. And we're actually going to remove that color because we want a pure shadow. We don't want to have any texture built into that. So there it is right there. That's the piece of geo there. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that our rocket is not visible in the scene. We don't need to see the rocket at all. We only need it to cast shadows. This is very straightforward. We simply grab all of the items that compose our rocket and we'll open the properties panel. And we make sure we're in the render tab and we make them unseen by camera. So what that'll mean is that they're not rendering in the camera. I'll go to the VPR and you can see that now. So that the rocket itself is not rendering in camera. However, it is still seen by the rays that are ray tracing the shadows. See, if I turn off unseen by rays, then the shadow disappears. So we want to leave that on. We want to make sure it casts shadows. If we turn off cast shadows, once again the shadows will disappear. So all we want to do is make sure all the elements of the rocket are unseen by camera. And we want to do the same thing with the hypervoxels. So once again, we simply grab the emitter, because hypervoxels themselves are an effect, not an object. So grab the emitter and we'll make it unseen by camera as well. Now, as I mentioned before, the shadows cast by the hypervoxels are not visible here in the VPR, so we need to do an F9 render to see what that looks like. And here's what the F9 render looks like. Before I made the rocket unseen by renders, I made this render, and we can see that the geometry and the hypervoxels are both casting shadows into the scene. Now, another thing that we need to do is we need to remove the background. We need to put the black ball in, and we need to make sure that only this plane is visible and that only the shadows are visible. So the first thing I'm going to do is take out all of the color imagery. I need to open my surface editor, open my ground plane material, and remove the color from it. I'm just going to make it white for the moment. And now we'll have simply a black cast on white. And we want the shadows to be black, and we want everything else to be white, so that we can create, that will basically invert it, and that will create a shadow for us. So our backdrop, rather than being colored, we actually want to make it white. So we'll open up the compositing options, and we'll turn off the background image. And if you recall, this makes our backdrop image appear. Now, before we put a black ball in this case we want it to be white, and we also don't care about receiving image-based lighting from this backdrop. So what we can do is we can simply turn that off, and we can make our backdrop color, right-click it to go to HSV and make our backdrop color white. And now we have nice shadows cast onto our ground plane geometry. You can see there's a little bit of shading out here where the illumination, where the light illumination is falling off a little bit. And that's okay. We can garbage matte that out. That's not going to be a big deal. One more thing we want to make sure to do with this render is we want to make sure that we turn off our global illumination. We don't need it in a shadow matte pass. That's just casting shadows onto the ground plane. And we want to go ahead and save this scene. Save scene as, and this one we want to make rocket ship shadow. And of course, once again, we want to go to Render Global's Output tab and set the RGB files to save in a new folder. We'll call it Shad. And we'll change the file name to Rocket Ship. I don't have to want to be inside there. Rocket Ship Shad 01. We'll just do a quick F9 test render to see how this is working. So here's what the render looks like. So we see we have the shadow of our rocket and the shadow of our hypervoxels, volumetric right in there, and we still have the little edge of this geometry. And I'm kind of thinking, for the purposes of this render, rather than having to garbage map that out and animate it, because with the camera's moving, it might be easier just to get rid of that. And here's an easy way I was thinking of to get rid of that. It's caused by light fall off. And the light fall off is really important in order for the intensity to look correct, because it's a small localized light source. However, for the purposes of this shadow matte, this bit of fall off probably isn't important. So I was thinking we could probably simply open up the light properties and to turn the fall off, and see if we can get that to work for us. So simply turn off the fall off, and I should probably turn my light intensity down to something more reasonable, something that's just going to blow this out. So let's see how high we need to go. 500% does it just fine. So it's 250. We'll stop there, and that's creating a nice shadow. We'll render it once again with the hypervoxels to make sure that that is all looking proper and compares favorably to the previous render in terms of shadow values. So I'll hit that render button. We'll take a look at that one as well. Okay, so here's our render with 250% light intensity and no fall off. Let's compare it with the previous render. So we've lost this fall off in the edge, which is good, but you'll also notice we've lost a little bit of subtle detail among the shadows of the hypervoxel. So let's take a look at that. I think what we want to do to try to counter that is bring the light down as low as we can, and keeping our polygon at white. So let's see what we can do in that regard. Just bring our light back down. 100 was too low, so let's try 150. Even 150 seems to do the job, so let's try 125. And we're just picking up the edge here. The trick is to get it as low as you can, just seeing the very edge there. And you know what, I think that's going to be acceptable. So that's as low as we can go. We're going to get as much detail in the shadow as we can. And once again, we'll just double check the render globals in here and make sure we're all set up. Output is rocketship shadow, and the scene is saved as rocketship shadow. The frame range is correct, so I'll save the scene. Okay, one of the things we definitely want to do is do a render pass which separates out the red, yellow, and blue parts of our materials here. And if we'll just take a peek in the VPR so we can remind ourselves. So the main part of the fuselage is red. The wings and leg struts are yellow, and then the outer wings and the feet are blue. And there might be a case in which once we get into our composite, that we want to alter these colors. We could even change them completely, or we might want to tweak them individually and separate from each other. The colors, the red, the yellow, and blue, are quite different color densities, and we're rendering in a floating point color space, which is EXR. So we're not 100% certain how they're going to come out, especially against this background plate, which is low range images, just regular Targas 8-bit imagery. So we're going to create mattes for these three separate colors, and instead of making them each a separate render pass with a white matte, we're going to combine three mattes into one render pass. This is a real time saver and a real render saver as well, because it means you can render three, you can even do 4 separate render passes. And the reason you can do it is because we can render out to RGB alpha channels. So we can, for example, put one of these colors in the red channel, one of these sets of polygons in the red channel, by the way, one in the green channel, one in the blue channel, and one in the alpha channel. So we only need 3 in this case. So I'll show you what I mean. First thing we need to do is, I'm going to switch out of the VPR so this doesn't render in the background. We're going to pop over into Modeler. We need to take our rocket ship model and make a new model with different surface colors. So first thing is we want to select by materials. So we'll go into polygons mode, type W, and down here we can select by surface name. So we want to select the body, which is the red bit. And if we pop back into layout, we'll just make sure we've got all the red bits. So the body, what else? The door is red. I think those are the only 2 items. So let's go back into Modeler, make sure we get the hatch as well. Surface hatch is red as well. And before we do this, actually, we should save this under a different surface, under a different object name. This is our master rocket ship, rocketship 04. We're going to save it as rocketship RGB mats. And because the modeler is connected to layout via the hub, when we go back to layout, we'll see that the object is automatically switched to rocketship RGB mats. And now this scene, which is rocketship master, needs to be saved as well. Save scene as rocketship RGB underscore mats. And we also want to, right away before we forget, set our render output directory so that we're not oversaving other files. So for output, we want to go back up to renders into the save directory where we had our other render passes, and we'll create a new folder, and we'll call it rocket RGB underscore mats. And inside that, our file names, RGB mats underscore, and then we'll save the scene again. That's to save the scene. Now everything is ready. Now, no matter what we do, this is non-destructive. We have our own model, our own scene file. And what we don't need in this scene file is we don't need the backdrop or the plane in here. So we'll open the scene editor first and turn off the ground plane. And we'll go to the backdrop options. And we'll turn off the backdrop. And we'll go to the compositing options. And we'll remove the background image. Because these are just matte passes. We also don't need really any lighting at all. So we can go to the render globals, make sure our global illumination is disabled. And we can go to back to our scene editor, and we can make sure the lights are turned off. There's only one light in the scene right now, so turn it off. That doesn't matter that we don't see it in the render right now. We're not going to need it. We're going to do all constant materials. So let's go back to our object here where we have the red body parts all selected, and we'll type Q to rename them, and we're simply going to call them red. And we'll make the material primary red. And you'll see why when we get to the end of this. Trust me. Turn the diffuse down. We don't want any diffuse shading. But what we do want when we open the surface editor and look at our new material red is we want a constant luminosity of red, so that wherever the body is, this is just a totally flat red. And that's it. So now let's move on to our yellow material. So we're going to select based on the surface again. First I'll deselect all the surfaces that are there. And now I'm going to select the surfaces, and those are the struts, and we need to get the wings inner as well in there. And we'll give those a surface Q, and we're going to call them green. Now I know they're yellow, but we don't need them to be yellow. We need them to be a single color channel so that they can be selected as a matte later. And once again, we'll go into our surface editor, turn up the luminosity so that it becomes constant. And then we'll select, we'll deselect that surface. And we'll find the outer wing now. Again in surfaces, wing outer, plus, and we'll give that a new name, blue, and we'll make it primary blue. And once again in the surface editor, turn up the luminous value to make it a flat blue. Now the trick is we want to select everything else and make it black and not render in the scene, because we only want mats for these three materials. Easy way to do that is to go to the surface red, select it, go to the surface green, add it, go to the surface blue and add it, and then select everything else by inverting your selection, which is double quotes. Now that these selections are inverted, I'm going to name them black, and I'm going to make them black. And in the surface editor, I'm going to, I should have made that capitalized, black. In the surface editor, I'll go to the advanced tab, and I'll make the alpha channel for this material constant value of 0. So it'll show up 0 in the alpha channel. It'll be black in the render. So all we'll get out of our render is these three surfaces, and everything else will be ignored. And that's okay because we have mats for them in other render passes. I'm going to save this object, S to save, pop over to layout, and we can see that our object is in there. Now we have, I'll just move it a little bit closer. Now we have three mat passes that can be used in the render. So I'll send that off to render, and we'll move on to creating our next mat pass. Alright, the next thing we want to do is create a mat pass for our little blinking lights down at the bottom. You may remember we had animated little tip lights at the tips of these wings. And we created a mat pass that's constant for them, but we don't have one that has them blinking on and off. And the reason why I'd like one blinking on and off is because I'd like to add a glow or a little intensity or a little effect to them that only happens when they blink on and off. So I'm definitely going to need a mat pass for that. So to begin with, the first thing I need is everything else to be black. Once again, I need to create a new model. So I'll go, and I need to create a new scene too. So I've started again with the rocket ship master scene. I'll pop over to modeler, open up the rocket ship 04 again. And the first thing I'm going to do is save this as, save object as rocket ship. This one is going to be called Tip Lights Anim. So, first thing I want to do is grab all the polygons of everything else. Well, the easy way to do that is to grab the 4 wing lights, just those 4. There's one of them. Wing light 2, wing light 3, and wing light 4, and then invert the selection. Once again, it's double quotes to invert the selection, and all of this stuff becomes black. So Q, I'm going to call it, oh, it's not in here, black, and I'm going to go to the surface editor and make the material black, again by surface by constant value of 0, so it won't show up in the mat pass at all, and it also won't show up in the render. And in its basic settings, its luminous and diffuse is off. Everything's off, so it won't show up in either the RGB render or in the mat pass. The next thing I want to do is grab each of the materials for the 4 wing light colors, and instead of being red, I need them to be white, because all they are is a mask. They're an area where an effect is going to be applied, so I don't need them to be red. I need them all to be white. So I'll multi-select them, right-click to switch this to HSV, and I'll turn saturation down to 0. So now they're all white. Now they're going to animate from white to black only. So I save this object, pop back over to layout, and now I need to, as soon as this will update in just a moment. There we go. And now I need to save the scene quickly before I overwrite my master scene by accident. Save scene as rocket ship wing lights mat. Once again, I don't need the ground plane or the backdrop. Open my scene editor, turn off the ground plane, open my compositing options to turn off the backdrop image, and I also have to open my backdrop options to turn off the textured environment. So let's take a look at this in the VPR. Alright, we see nothing yet because of course the lights haven't started working. We need to find a frame where the lights are blinking on. There's one right there. So if we just go forward quickly, we can see it looks like we have some volumetrics turned on as well. So we'll make sure to open our Windows volumetric options and turn off hypervoxels. And once again, we'll go to our render globals and make sure the global illumination is turned off. And go to our scene editor and make sure that our light is turned off. We don't need any lighting for simple matte passes. This render is ready to go. I simply have to open my render globals and make sure my output is set to a new directory. So this one will be called Rocket Wing Light Matte, and that's the name we'll also give the file inside as well. Rocketship Wing Light Matte. Descriptive names are always a good idea. And then once that's all done, we'll do a test render to make sure it's working. And so there's the render with one of the tip lights on. We'll check the alpha channel as well. The alpha channel shows all 4 lights, which we actually have in another render anyways, but that's fine. And I simply need to resave this scene, and this one is also ready to render. Alright, the next render pass we're after is for the antenna. You may recall that we put a luminosity envelope on the antenna so it would start blinking, blink faster and faster and faster as the startup sequence started. I've noticed that it doesn't read as well as it could, so that's something I'm definitely going to want to push a little bit once we get into compositing in Nuke. So I'm going to build a mat for that as well, and it's the same process. We'll go back to our, first of all, start with our rocketship 4 from our master scene and open up the polygon stats and find the antenna material and select all the polygons with that material. Invert that selection and make everything else black. So Q, call it black. Make sure to open the surface editor and make sure the black in the advanced tab has a constant value of 0 so it doesn't show up in the alpha channel as well. And then we'll open up the antenna material itself and make sure that it is white only and becoming luminous. So there's a node-based material on. You may recall that we used a dielectric node on this material to create a transparent material that had refraction. We don't need that for a simple matte pass. So we're actually going to turn that off and simply make it white. Turn off the specularity and turn the diffuse off as well, so that the render becomes simply just a flat render. It'll just go on and off and on and off, black to gray to white, and we'll use that as our mask to apply our effect in compositing. And definitely we need to remember to save this under a different name so we don't overwrite our master rocket ship. I should have done that first actually. Save object as rocketship antenna matte. And once we go over to layout, it should pop in there in just a second because we're connected by the hub. There it is. And now I'll save the master scene as file save scene as rocketship antenna matte. Now we can go ahead and change anything we want in the scene. Once again, we don't need the light turned on. We don't need the ground plane turned on. We don't need the backdrop turned on. texture and environment. In the compositing tab, we don't need the backdrop image in either. So let's look at the surface editor and find a frame when the antenna is on. We can look in the luminosity envelope for that. So a frame such as frame 107. So we'll look on frame 107, and we should see the render appear when we do an F9 render. Okay, we still have radiosity turned on as well. We have to remember to turn that off. Yep, so there it is. That mat is working properly. Go to our render globals, global illumination, make sure to disable radiosity, and we also had a volumetrics on, so we'll make sure to disable that. So now this render should be ready to go. Let's just double check our outputs. Output to, we need to create a new directory for this. So this directory will be called rocket antenna mat, and inside there we'll name the file also appropriately, rocketship antenna underscore mat. Save the scene file. And this scene is also ready for the render queue. Here's a little tip, by the way, if you're going ahead and setting up a whole bunch of these scenes and you want to set them up to render one after another, you don't want to have to load them up every time. We can use something called render queue. So over here under the render tab, we have something called render queue. You open your render queue. It's really simple. You have this little interface. You can add as many scenes as you want and start them rendering. So I'll just add a few render scenes here that we have. The antenna mat, for example, we'll stick that in there. We'll add the wing lights mat, and we'll add the RGB mat. Now once you have these, they'll render in order from top to bottom. You can change their order by selecting one and moving it up or moving it down, moving it to the top, and so forth. It's really very straightforward. Once you get your scenes set up in the order you wish them to render, simply hit the render button. It'll load up the first scene, render it. When it's done, it'll load up the second scene, render it. When it's done, it'll load up the third scene. So you could set up 20 scenes, set them up before you go to bed at night, shoot them off to render, come back in the morning, and you have a ton of renders complete. Okay, you may remember we did a shadow pass which contained both the rocket and the volumetrics, the smoke shadow. And I've decided that I think we need those shadows to be separate. It's pretty easy to do. I'll just go ahead to load a scene, and we'll load up the rocket ship shadow scene that we created previously. And here it is. So if we look at the VPR, you're not going to see the shadows from the hypervoxels in there, but you can see the shadow from the rocket ship in there. And if we look at, we'll just do a quick F9 render and take a look at it. Okay, so there it is. There's our hypervoxels, and you can see our rocket ship together, and our alpha channel is empty. So the deal is we want to be able to separate our rocket from our volumetric, and the reason is the volumetrics are looking a little bit harsh and a little bit CG, so we're going to want to soften them up and do a little bit of work with them without affecting the nice crisp edge of the rocket ship shadow. So to begin with, let's just take the rocket ship out of the mix and just allow the hypervoxels to render by themselves. Very easy to do. First we'll save the scene as, right now it's rocket ship shadow, and we'll call it smoke shadow, and go to render globals and rename the output. New directory, smoke shadow. call the file inside there the same smoke shadow. Save the scene. And all we have to do is open the scene editor and disable the rocket ship and leave the emitter on. So all of these objects that are part of the rocket ship simply need to be disabled. Or you could also do it by opening object properties, going to the render and unseen, click on unseen by camera, which is basically the same thing. And then this scene is ready to render. So I'll save it, set it aside, and put it in my render queue later. Now I want to go back to the previous scene, which had the smoke and the rocket ship in it. And this time I want to turn off just the hypervoxels. So once again, I'll save the scene with a new name, and this time I'll call it rocket ship rocket shadow. Actually, I'll just call it rocket shadow. And open the render globals. Again, I need a new output directory. New folder, rocket shadow. And there's one more thing here. I just want to turn on the backdrop image. It's the rocket ship plate sequence. And I want to make sure that the edge of my geometry here lines up with the edge of the actual table, because if we look in the wireframe mode, we'll see that the table ends there and the shadow must wrap over here, and we can see that the line of the geometry doesn't quite match up. It's important to try to get that so that otherwise the shadow will extend past the table once we get into compositing. So I'll grab this piece of geometry and simply shift it over, and I can rotate a little bit. I'm actually just going to make sure to turn off the pitch in the bank so I don't accidentally rotate on those axes, and try to get that as perfect as I can. And then you notice we're on frame 197, so I want to key that back at frame 1, and I'll also key it at frame 0 just to make sure, and I'll delete the keyframe here so now it won't move. We'll see if that tracks properly. Looks like it tracks not bad. Lines up fairly well towards the end of the shot. After the rocket ship takes off is where we're going to see the shadow creep over the edge here, so that should be good. So let's just check our VPR to make sure that our shadow is working properly here. Let me get towards the end. Looks like our geo could go over just a little bit more. It's not quite making it over there, is it? So we'll try just shifting it over a little bit. And go out of the VPR mode to do that. Need to nudge it over just a little bit more. Alright, that should do the trick. And once again, I'll key that back at frame 1 and frame 0 and delete the current keyframe. Rocket ship shadow, and I set the output rocket ship shadow good. So I'll save this scene. And it also is ready for the render queue. So I'll open up the render queue, and I'll go ahead and add the rocket shadow, and I also want the smoke shadow. And there it is. It looks like I should have named this rocket ship Rocket Shadow. My naming convention isn't quite right. I'd be naming everything else Rocket Ship, so uh, I'll just leave that for now. This is just me working, but if I was working in a pipeline, I'd definitely want to make sure all those names were consistent. Okay, now those two scenes are ready to roll, and I'll render them. Alright, now that our renders are all completed, we just want to review them to make sure they're all right before we get into serious compositing. And there's lots of different ways to view your renders. Um, often you can look at single frames in Photoshop or whatever, but we want to really look over our sequences, so we're going to use Nuke. Now you can get Nuke as a personal learning edition. It's free. It's a great way to learn this powerful tool. And the only real problem with it is it has a watermark over it, which is these sparkly little squares. But that doesn't prevent us from learning how the tools work, that's for sure. So we're going to go over the Nuke interface in the next segment where we actually do our compositing. For now, we're just going to load up our file sequences, have a look over them, and make sure they're rendered properly. Loading a file sequence and viewing it in Nuke is incredibly easy. There's this little icon, this little file in icon. We'll do a read node, and we'll go to our lights mat and open that. So there it is. And the easy way is just connect it to the viewer, and we can see you can see the watermark all over it, these little colored dots. And if we play this, we can play through it and see that we have a lights mat for the 4 tip lights. This is the first mat that we did. You may remember the 4 tip lights and the antenna together. These aren't the animated ones. This is the constant mat, and this will be used if we decide that we want to make an overall change to those materials. Whereas the animated ones are if we want to make a change to, for example, the blinkiness of them, or the brightness, or the glow on the blinks, or whatever. So what we do is, here, I'll just stop this. We simply read in, we'll go back up, and we'll pick the next one, rocket, and we'll have a look at it. And this is basically the process of going through your various renders and looking over them to make sure they work. This is a render check. It's always crucial as a CG artist for you to check all of your rendered frames before handing them off to, if somebody else is doing your compositing, you'll be handing off your frames to another artist. And it's kind of rude to hand a sequence of frames when some of them are failed or broken. So it's really a very responsible thing of you to check over every single frame in every single sequence before you hand it off. So I'll just check out the ambient shadow. And what I did here was I simply turned on a white backdrop and generated ray trace shadows to give us this soft ambient shadow that was missing in the other passes. We didn't actually go over that, but it's fairly straightforward. And you can see as it takes off, the shadow kind of disappears, so that's pretty good. Let's load up the next one, the antenna mat. And we'll play that. We won't see it until it starts animating, of course, which is a little bit later on in the sequence. There we go. Yeah, so there it is. It's starting to blink and turn on as expected. And then eventually it stays on for the liftoff. So that one appears to be working. And we'll check the next sequence, the rocket shadow. So we can see we've made a mistake on this render. We've rendered it with the background image in. And this is what I mean. This is what's so important about render checks. We need to be able to be sure that when we hand our renders off to another artist, that they're going to be correct. And this is a mistake. However, the good news is that you may recall that after we did this pass, we decided to separate out the rocket and the hypervoxels into separate shadow passes. So we're not actually going to use this pass. So we'll check out those other two passes. Hopefully they'll have the backdrop turned off and we won't have to re-render them. So once again, we'll read in the next one, wing light matte. And this again is the animated tip lights, so we won't see them come on until a little bit later in the scene, so we'll go a little forward. There we go, they're starting to, it's hard to see them among the little watermarks, but if we play them, you'll see them blinking. So those seem to be working. Those will be nice to add a little glow to those red tip lights and bring a little bit of attention to them because they're not really that visible yet. And the next one will be the rocket RGB mats. So you may remember this is where we split some of the geometry into 3 primary colors to be used as separate mats in case we want to adjust the colors. There it is, and this is what this one looks like rendered out. So that has rendered as expected. We have our outer wings, our inner wings and legs, and our fuselage, each in a separate channel. We're going to look at how to separate those out into their own mats and use them to adjust those individual colors. Okay, here's a shadow pass. We'll take the EXR one. Looks like I accidentally started rendering targas. And then when I found that out, I stopped and I went ahead and re-rendered them properly as EXR files. Just going to move some of these out of the way, make myself a little bit of space here. So here's the shadow pass that we did. Now, I just realized looking through these passes that this is the original shadow pass we did with both the rocket and the hypervoxels in them, and then we wanted to separate it. And what I did then was I rendered this one over here, and this is supposed to be the rocket shadow by itself, but this has both the rocket and the hypervoxels in it, and it has the backdrop in it. So this render pass, which is supposed to be the rocket shadow alone, is really actually totally borked. So that's going to need to be redone for sure. And let's look at what we have left. So one render pass out of all of those is no good so far. We have the smoke. So we'll look at the EXRs of the smoke and see how that worked. That looks not too bad. Yeah, that's worked. The smoke is working. And I believe there's one more pass, and that's the smoke shadow pass. Let's see if that one worked. The rocket ship shadow pass didn't work. We'll look at the smoke shadow pass. Okay, well, it looks like the smoke shadow pass worked just fine. So the only render that we have to go back and fix up is the separate rocket pass. So I'm going to go ahead and set up and fix that pass. I don't think you need to see that again. You've seen how to set up these passes a few times. And hope you'll join me in the next segment, which will be our compositing segment.